The amber horizon swallowed the last remnants of sunlight as Vance Morgan tended his solitary campfire, the orange flames dancing like spirits against the darkening Montana sky of 1879. He had wandered these plains for 3 years now, keeping to himself, speaking only when necessary, and never, not once, inviting another soul to share the warmth of his fire. "Stay with me, ghost," he murmured to the white stallion tethered nearby, the only living creature he truly trusted. The horse nickered softly in response, steam rising from its nostrils in the cooling evening air. Vance added another log to the fire, watching as the sparks spiraled upward toward the emerging stars. The snap of a twig in the darkness caused his hand to move instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. 3 years alone on the frontier had taught him caution. Caution kept a man alive. "Who's there?" he called, his voice gruff from disuse. A figure emerged from the shadows, hands raised slightly. "Don't shoot, mister. I'm just looking for a place to warm up." The figure stepped into the firelight, and Vance felt something stir inside him that he'd thought long dead. A woman stood before him, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her dress torn and muddied from travel. Her eyes, though weary, held determination, and something else, a quiet dignity that spoke of hardship endured. "This is private," Vance said, his words clipped. "There's a town about 15 miles east." 15 miles might as well be 100 when you've been walking all day," she replied, lowering her hands. "My name is Lillian Eldridge. My wagon wheel broke about 5 miles back. I saw your fire from the ridge." Vance stared at her, his jaw set. He didn't share his fire. Never had. That had been his rule since leaving Kansas City with nothing but ghost and the clothes on his back. Sharing meant talking, and talking meant questions about his past. Lillian took a tentative step closer, the firelight illuminating her face more clearly. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen more than her fair share of hardship. "I have food," she offered, holding up a small bundle. "I can share." Vance's stomach betrayed him with a low growl. He'd been surviving on jerky and coffee for the past 2 days, saving his last can of beans for tomorrow. "Fine," he said finally, motioning to the opposite side of the fire. "But come morning, we part ways." Relief washed over her face as she settled across from him, the fire between them like a barrier. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan, Vance Morgan." "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." They sat in silence as she unwrapped her bundle, revealing a half loaf of bread and some dried apple slices. She offered him half, which he accepted with a nod, deliberately avoiding her gaze. "You're not much for conversation, are you, Mr. Morgan?" she asked after several minutes of silence. "Don't see much point in it," he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Words don't change anything." She studied him over the flames, her eyes thoughtful. "Words might not change the past, but they can make the present more bearable." Vance didn't respond, instead focusing on his meager meal. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shared food with another person, let alone a woman. It made him uneasy, like an ill-fitting saddle. "Where are you headed?" she asked, seemingly undeterred by his reticence. "Nowhere particular." "Everyone's headed somewhere, Mr. Morgan." He looked up then, meeting her gaze directly. "Not me. I just keep moving." "Running from something?" The question was direct, but her tone held no judgment. Vance felt a flare of irritation. This was exactly why he avoided company. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who's only here by my charity." Lillian didn't flinch at his harsh words. "Forgive me. It's been a while since I've had anyone to talk to. I'm headed to Helena. My sister lives there with her husband." Despite himself, Vance found himself asking, "Where are you coming from?" "St. Louis," she replied, her fingers playing with a loose thread on her sleeve. "My father passed last month. There's nothing left for me there now." Vance nodded, understanding loss better than most. "Sorry to hear it." They lapsed into silence again. but it felt less strained now. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Lillian wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and Vance noticed her shiver. Without thinking, he stood and walked around the fire, offering his blanket. "Here, the nights get cold out here." Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, and Vance felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. He quickly withdrew his hand and returned to his side of the fire. "Thank you," she said softly, wrapping the blanket around herself. "You're kinder than you pretend to be, Mr. Morgan." Vance didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. Instead, he poured another cup of coffee and stared into the flames, trying to ignore the strange feeling in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. As the night deepened, Lillian eventually drifted off to sleep, her breathing becoming slow and even. Vance watched her for a moment, then looked up at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow she would continue to Helena, and he would ride on alone, as he always had. Yet, as he settled back against his saddle for the night, he found himself wondering what Helena might be like this time of year. Morning arrived with a gentle mist hovering over the plains. Vance had been awake since dawn, preparing coffee and checking on Ghost. He glanced over at Lillian, still asleep beneath his blanket, her face peaceful in repose. Something about her presence had disturbed the careful isolation he'd built around himself, and he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. When she finally stirred, the sun had cleared the horizon. She sat up, blinking in the morning light, and offered him a tentative smile. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan." "Morning," he replied, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected, given the circumstances." She accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her slender fingers around the warm cup. "Thank you for the blanket." Vance merely nodded, turning his attention back to the fire. He'd already decided what he needed to do, though it went against every rule he'd set for himself over the past 3 years. "I'll ride with you to where your wagon broke down," he said finally. "See if it can be fixed." Lillian looked up, surprise evident in her eyes. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He stood, brushing dirt from his pants. "But I'm going to anyway." They broke camp quickly, Vance packing his few belongings onto Ghost. He helped Lillian onto the stallion, and then led the horse by the reins, following her directions back to her stranded wagon. They traveled in companionable silence, the vast Montana landscape stretching around them in all directions. "May I ask what brings you out here alone, Mr. Morgan?" Lillian asked after some time had passed. Most men traveling these parts either ride with others or stick to the established routes. Vance kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I prefer my own company." "That much is evident," she said with a hint of amusement in her voice. "But surely there's more to it than that." He sighed, recognizing that she wasn't going to let it drop. "I was a deputy marshal in Kansas City. Things happened. Now I'm not." "That's quite a story," she remarked dryly. "Very detailed." Despite himself, Vance felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "You'll have to make do with it for now." They reached her wagon by midday. It sat abandoned by the side of the trail, one wheel completely shattered. Vance helped Lillian down from Ghost and examined the damage. "Can it be fixed?" she asked, standing beside him. He shook his head slowly. "Not out here. You'd need a proper wheelwright." He studied the rest of the wagon, noting the belongings still packed inside. "Is there anything valuable you need to take with you?" Lillian moved to the wagon and began sorting through her possessions. "Just some clothes, my father's watch, and a few books I couldn't bear to leave behind." Vance helped her gather what she could carry, securing the items to Ghost's saddle. As they worked, he found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the graceful way she moved, the determination in her actions. "Helena's still a good 3 days' ride from here," he said as they finished. I could take you there." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. He hadn't planned to offer, had told himself he would help her with the wagon, and then be on his way. Yet here he was, extending his solitude for a woman he barely knew. Lillian studied him thoughtfully. "Are you certain? I wouldn't want to impose on your solitude any more than I already have. I'm offering," he said simply. "Take it or leave it." A smile spread across her face, brightening her features in a way that made Vance's breath catch. "Then I accept, Mr. Morgan, and I promise not to ask too many questions along the way." "I doubt that very much," he replied, but there was no real annoyance in his tone. They set out again, Lillian riding Ghost while Vance walked alongside. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising rain before nightfall. "We should find shelter," Vance said, eyeing the sky. "There's a line of trees about a mile ahead. Might be a creek there, too." They pushed on, reaching the trees just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Vance quickly located a suitable spot beneath a cluster of pines where the ground remained relatively dry. He set about making camp with practiced efficiency, erecting a small lean-to from canvas he carried in his pack. The rain fell steadily now, drumming against the canvas and turning the world beyond their shelter into a gray haze. Vance built a small fire, shielded from the worst of the rain by the lean-to, and they huddled close to it for warmth. "You've done this before," Lillian observed, watching him. "A time or two," he admitted, setting coffee to boil. "Was it always alone?" The question hit closer to home than she could have known. "Not always," he said after a moment, "but for a while now, yes." Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a low rumble of thunder. Ghost whinnied nervously, and Vance moved to calm the stallion, speaking softly and stroking his nose until the animal settled. "You're good with him," Lillian said when Vance returned to the fire. "He's been with me through a lot," Vance replied, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "More loyal than most people I've known." "Is that why you prefer his company to humans?" Vance handed her a cup, their fingers brushing briefly. "Horses don't betray you. They don't lie." "Neither do I, Mr. Morgan," she said softly, meeting his gaze directly. "In case you were wondering." Something in her steady gaze made Vance look away first. "It's just Vance," he said gruffly. "No need for formalities out here." She smiled, warming her hands on the cup. "Then you should call me Lillian." The rain continued through the evening, trapping them in their small shelter. To Vance's surprise, the conversation flowed more easily than he'd expected. Lillian told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her father who had been a school teacher, and her hopes of perhaps teaching herself someday in Helena. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "You said you were a deputy marshal. What happened?" Vance stared into the fire, debating how much to tell her. It had been 3 years since he'd spoken of it to anyone. "I trusted the wrong person," he said finally. "My partner was taking bribes from a local gang. When I found out and confronted him, things got ugly. There was a shootout. A woman died an innocent bystander." He paused, the memory still raw. "My partner blamed me, said I fired the shot that killed her. No one could prove otherwise, but the doubt was enough. I left before they could strip me of my badge." Lillian was quiet for a long moment. "Did you fire that shot?" "No," he said firmly. "But it doesn't matter. She died because I trusted a man I shouldn't have." "So you stopped trusting altogether," she said, understanding in her voice. "And you've been punishing yourself ever since." Vance looked at her sharply. "I'm not punishing myself. I'm just living the way that makes sense to me. Alone, always moving, never letting anyone close," she countered gently. "If that's not punishment, I don't know what is." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, needing space. "I'll check on the horse." Outside the lean-to, the rain had lessened to a light drizzle. Vance stood beside Ghost, stroking the horse's mane absently, his mind in turmoil. How had this woman he'd known for barely a day seen through defenses that had taken him years to build? When he returned to the shelter, Lillian had spread out her bedroll. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," she said quietly. "It wasn't my place to judge your choices." Vance sighed, settling back down by the fire. "No, you're right. I've been running for 3 years. Doesn't mean I'm ready to stop." "We all run from something, Vance," she said, her use of his first name sounding strangely intimate in the small space. "The trick is knowing when it's time to stand still." He looked at her then, really looked at her and felt something shift inside him. "And what are you running from, Lillian?" She smiled sadly. "Who says I'm running? Maybe I'm finally moving toward something instead." The rain tapered off during the night, and morning brought clear skies and the fresh scent of wet earth. They broke camp early, eager to make up for lost time. Vance insisted that Lillian continue riding Ghost while he walked alongside, though she protested that they could take turns. "I'm used to walking," he assured her, "and we'll make better time this way." The day passed pleasantly as they made their way across the rolling Montana landscape. Vance found himself pointing out landmarks to Lillian, sharing knowledge of the territory he'd accumulated during his solitary travels. She listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a quick intelligence. By late afternoon, they came upon a small homestead nestled in a valley. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a few chickens pecked in the yard. "Might be a good place to ask for shelter for the night," Vance suggested, though the thought of interacting with strangers made him uneasy. "Sleeping indoors would do you good." "Us both," Lillian corrected him with a smile. They approached the homestead cautiously. A weathered man in his 50s emerged from the barn, eyeing them warily until Lillian explained their situation. "Name's Thomas Wilson," he said, extending a hand to Vance. "My wife Sarah's inside. You folks are welcome to stay the night. Been a while since we had company out this way." Sarah Wilson proved to be a warm, motherly woman who fussed over Lillian the moment they entered the small cabin. "You poor dear, traveling all this way with just this taciturn fellow for company," she said, shooting an appraising look at Vance. "Come, let me show you where you can freshen up." Left alone with Thomas, Vance felt the familiar discomfort of social interaction. The older man seemed to sense it, merely nodding toward a chair. "Sit if you like. Sarah's got stew on." Vance sat, removing his hat. "Appreciate the hospitality." "Been married 30 years, Thomas said, taking the chair opposite. "No better than to argue when Sarah decides to mother someone." A small smile tugged at Vance's lips. "Seems like a good woman." "The best," Thomas agreed simply. "Your wife seems a fine lady, too." Vance stiffened. We're not together. I'm just helping her reach Helena." Thomas raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment further. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Sarah's stew was the best meal Vance had eaten in months, and the conversation flowed naturally. The Wilsons had homesteaded in Montana for 15 years, raising 3 sons who were now grown with families of their own. "What takes you to Helena, Miss Eldridge?" Sarah asked as she served apple pie for dessert. "My sister lives there," Lillian replied. "After my father passed, I decided it was time for a change." "Brave girl, making such a journey alone," Sarah remarked, glancing between Lillian and Vance. "Good thing you found a protector along the way." Vance felt heat rise to his face and focused intently on his pie. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Vance on a pallet in the main room, Lillian in the small guest room, she paused in the doorway, looking back at him. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for today, but for everything since we met." Vance nodded, unsure what to say. As he settled onto his pallet, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling, he realized with a start that for the first time in 3 years, he felt a sense of peace. The next morning, they set out after a hearty breakfast and profuse thanks to the Wilsons. Sarah packed them food for the journey, and Thomas gave Vance directions that would shorten their route to Helena. "Should reach town by tomorrow evening if the weather holds," Vance said as they traveled, the sun warm on their backs. The countryside had begun to change, becoming more populated as they neared the territorial capital. "And then what will you do?" Lillian asked, walking beside him now despite his protests that she should ride. She'd insisted on sharing the burden, and Vance had eventually relented. "Move on, I suppose," he replied, though the thought no longer held the appeal it once had. "That's what I do." "You could stay," she suggested, her voice carefully neutral. "Helena's a growing town. They probably need lawmen." Vance tensed at the suggestion. "I left that life behind." "Did you? Or are you just waiting for a reason to go back to it?" He didn't answer, and they walked in silence for a time. Around midday, they stopped to rest by a clear stream, allowing Ghost to drink while they ate some of the food Sarah had provided. "I've been thinking," Lillian said as they prepared to continue their journey. "My sister's husband owns a freight business. He might have work for someone who knows the territory as well as you do." Vance looked at her, surprised by the suggestion. "You don't even know if they'll have room for you, let alone a stranger." "Catherine and Edward have a large house," she replied confidently, "and Edward always complains about finding reliable men." She hesitated, then added more softly, "It was just a thought." They traveled on, making good progress throughout the afternoon. As the sun began to set, they found a suitable campsite near another small creek. It would be their last night on the trail before reaching Helena. Vance built the fire with practiced ease, aware of Lillian watching him. Over the past few days, he had grown accustomed to her presence, even coming to anticipate their conversations. The thought that tomorrow they would reach Helena and part ways left him with an unexpected, hollow feeling. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked, settling beside him near the fire. They no longer maintained the careful distance of that first night. Now they sat comfortably close, sharing the warmth of the flames. "Nothing important," he lied. She studied him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're not a very good liar, Vance Morgan." He sighed, poking at the fire with a stick. "Just thinking about tomorrow." "About leaving," she said, understanding immediately. "You don't have to, you know." Vance looked up at her, caught by the sincerity in her expression. "What would I do in Helena? I'm not meant for town life." "How do you know unless you try?" she challenged gently. "You've been wandering for 3 years, punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Maybe it's time to stop." Her words struck a chord deep within him, touching on truths he'd been avoiding. "It's not that simple, Lillian." "It could be," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached out, her hand covering his. "If you wanted it to be." The touch of her hand on his sent warmth, spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire. Without thinking, he turned his palm up, his fingers interlacing with hers. They sat like that, neither speaking, as the fire crackled and night deepened around them. Later, as Lillian slept wrapped in his blanket, Vance remained awake, staring up at the stars. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to contemplate a different kind of future, one that didn't involve constant movement, one that might include companionship, purpose, and perhaps something more. The next day dawned bright and clear. They packed up camp for the last time, both unusually quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Helena appeared on the horizon by early afternoon, the buildings of the bustling town, a stark contrast to the wilderness they had traveled through. "We're almost there," Lillian said, a mix of emotions in her voice, excitement, apprehension, and something that might have been regret. Vance nodded, his jaw tight. With each step closer to town, he felt the weight of decision pressing upon him. Continue his solitary existence, or take a chance on something new, something that terrified him far more than any gunfight ever had. They entered Helena as the town clock struck 3. The streets were busy with people going about their business, barely sparing a glance for the dusty travelers. Lillian directed them toward a large house on a tree-lined street at the edge of town. "This is it," she said as they stopped in front of an impressive 2-story home. Catherine and Edward's place. Vance stood awkwardly, holding Ghost's reins, suddenly acutely aware of his trail-worn appearance and the inadequacy of their goodbye. "Well," he said stiffly, "I guess this is where we part ways." Lillian looked at him, disappointment evident in her eyes. "Is that really what you want?" Before he could answer, the front door opened and a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Lillian rushed out, her face alight with joy. "Lillian! Oh my goodness, is it really you?" she cried, embracing her sister tightly. "Edward, come quickly, Lillian's here." A tall, broad-shouldered man appeared in the doorway, smiling warmly. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise." Amid the flurry of greetings and explanations, Vance began to back away, preparing to slip quietly into the crowds of Helena and continue on his solitary way. But Lillian caught his movement and reached out, grasping his arm. "This is Vance Morgan," she said firmly, drawing him back into the circle. "He saved my life when my wagon broke down. I wouldn't be here without him." Catherine and Edward turned their attention to him, gratitude in their expressions. "Mr. Morgan, we can't thank you enough," Edward said, extending his hand. Vance shook it awkwardly. "It was nothing." "Nothing?" Lillian protested. "You shared your fire with me when you didn't have to. You've guided me safely across miles of wilderness. That's hardly nothing." "Please, Mr. Morgan, you must stay for dinner at least," Catherine insisted. "Let us thank you properly." Vance looked at Lillian, whose eyes held a silent plea. "I suppose I could stay for dinner," he conceded. Edward clapped him on the shoulder. "Excellent, and we'll find a place for your horse in the stable out back." The Emerson home was warm and welcoming, filled with comfortable furniture and the signs of a happy family life. There were 2 children. Vance learned a boy of 10 and a girl of 8 currently staying with their maternal grandparents in town, while Edward's parents visited from back east. Over dinner, Lillian recounted their journey, tactfully omitting the more personal aspects of their conversations. Vance said little, overwhelmed by the family setting and the path his thoughts had taken. "So, Mr. Morgan," Edward said as they enjoyed coffee after the meal, "Lillian mentioned you were once a lawman?" Vance shot Lillian a surprised look before answering. "Deputy Marshal in Kansas City, yes." "Interesting," Edward mused. "As it happens, Helena's looking for a new deputy. The last fellow moved on to Butte last month." "I'm not looking for that kind of work anymore," Vance said quickly. Edward nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "Well, if you change your mind, Sheriff Patterson is a good man, fair, honest." He paused. "In the meantime, I could use someone who knows the territory to help with my freight business. We're expanding routes to the smaller settlements, and a man with your experience would be valuable." Vance blinked, caught off guard by the offer. I hadn't planned on staying in Helena." "Where had you planned on going?" Catherine asked innocently. The question hung in the air, unanswerable because he truly had no destination in mind. He'd been drifting for so long. The concept of staying in one place seemed foreign. "Think about it," Edward suggested, sensing Vance's discomfort. "No need to decide tonight. We've plenty of room here if you'd like to stay a few days." Later, as Edward showed Vance to a comfortable guest room, the older man paused in the doorway. "She thinks highly of you, you know," he said quietly. "I can tell by the way she talks about you." Vance didn't pretend to misunderstand. "We've only known each other a few days," Edward smiled knowingly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." He bid Vance good night, leaving him alone with thoughts that kept him awake long into the night. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast, Edward invited Vance to accompany him to his office to discuss potential work. Lillian watched them go, a hopeful expression on her face that Vance couldn't bring himself to discourage, despite the uncertainty churning within him. Edward's freight business occupied a large building near the railway station. Inside, clerks worked at desks while laborers loaded and unloaded wagons in the yard behind. It was a well-run operation, and as Edward showed him around, Vance found himself impressed. "I need someone to oversee the new routes," Edward explained. "Someone who can handle themselves if trouble arises, who knows the land and who can make decisions on their own." He looked at Vance directly. "Someone like you." "I appreciate the offer," Vance said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person." Edward considered him thoughtfully. "Because you don't think you deserve a second chance?" Vance stiffened. "Did Lillian tell you about my past?" "Only that you left law enforcement under difficult circumstances," Edward assured him. "The details aren't important to me. What matters is the man you are now, and from what I've seen and heard, you're a man of integrity who helped my sister-in-law when she needed it most." The sincerity in Edward's voice was unmistakable, and Vance found himself wavering. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I ask," Edward replied with a smile. "Now, let me introduce you to Sheriff Patterson while we're out. No pressure, just a friendly meeting." Sheriff Harlan Patterson turned out to be a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement with a dry sense of humor and a straightforward manner that Vance found refreshing. The two men spent an hour discussing the challenges of maintaining order in a rapidly growing town like Helena, finding common ground in their experiences. "We could use a man with your background," Patterson said as they prepared to leave. "Deputy's position is yours if you want it. No questions asked about your past. Everyone deserves a clean slate." Vance thanked him non-committally, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts as he and Edward headed back to the house. They found Lillian and Catherine in the garden, deep in conversation that ceased abruptly when the men approached. Lillian looked up at Vance, her expression questioning. "How did it go?" she asked, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the house. "Your brother-in-law is quite the businessman," Vance replied, deliberately vague. "And the sheriff?" He glanced at her, surprised. "Edward told you about that?" She smiled. Catherine mentioned that it was part of their plan for the day. "Plan?" Vance raised an eyebrow. "Are you all conspiring to keep me in Helena?" "Would that be so terrible?" she asked softly. Vance stopped, turning to face her fully. "Why do you care whether I stay or go?" Lillian met his gaze unflinchingly. "Because in the short time I've known you, I've come to care about what happens to you. Because I think you deserve more than an endless journey to nowhere. Because—" She hesitated, then continued more quietly. "Because when I'm with you, I feel something I've never felt before." Her honest admission left him speechless. For 3 years he had avoided connection, convinced that he didn't deserve it, that it would only lead to more pain. Yet here was this remarkable woman offering him a chance at something he had believed forever beyond his reach. "I'm not good at this, Lillian," he said finally, "at letting people in, at staying in one place." "I know," she replied gently. "I'm just asking you to try." That evening, after dinner, Vance found himself alone with Lillian on the front porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of their first night by the fire. "I spoke with Sheriff Patterson again this afternoon," he said after a comfortable silence. "He offered me the deputy position." Lillian turned to him, hope brightening her features. "And?" "I told him I'd think about it," Vance replied, "but I'm leaning toward accepting Edward's offer instead. Less complicated." Her smile was worth every moment of uncertainty he'd endured. "So you're staying in Helena?" "For now," he said, still cautious but feeling lighter than he had in years. "I can't promise it will work out, but I'm willing to try." Lillian's hand found his, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they'd been doing it for years. That's all anyone can do. As they sat together watching the sunset, Vance realized that for the first time since that fateful day in Kansas City, he was looking toward the future with something resembling hope. The weeks that followed brought changes Vance could never have anticipated. He accepted Edward's offer, taking charge of organizing routes for the expanding freight business. The work suited him, It allowed him to use his knowledge of the territory while giving him a sense of purpose he had long been missing. He found lodgings in a small but comfortable boarding house not far from the Emerson home, though he spent most evenings dining with Lillian and her family. The children, Jamie and Emma, returned from their grandparents and took an immediate liking to him, particularly 10-year-old Jamie, who was fascinated by Vance's stories of the frontier. Helena itself proved to be a town in transition, balancing its rough frontier past with aspirations of civility and permanence. There were still saloons and the occasional brawl, but also churches, schools, and a growing community of families putting down roots. Vance's relationship with Lillian deepened gradually. They took walks together in the evenings, attended community gatherings, and slowly, Vance found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone before. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about joining the Marshal Service out of a desire to make a difference, about the dreams he'd once had before cynicism and betrayal hardened him. In turn, she shared her hopes for the future, her desire to teach, her love of literature, her quiet faith that good would ultimately prevail over hardship. "I've been offered a position at the school," she told him one evening as they sat on a bench in the small town park, "teaching the younger children. I start next month." Vance smiled, genuinely happy for her. "They're fortunate to have you. You'll be excellent at it." "It feels right," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." "I know the feeling," he admitted, surprising himself with the realization that it was true. Helena was beginning to feel like home, largely because of the woman beside him. Their first kiss came naturally, on a moonlit evening after a town dance. Vance had surprised both Lillian and himself by agreeing to attend, and more surprisingly still, had enjoyed himself. As he walked her back to the Emerson home, their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences. At the gate to the front yard, Lillian paused, turning to face him. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "I never expected to see Vance Morgan dancing a Virginia reel." He chuckled, still a bit embarrassed by his uncharacteristic participation. "Neither did I. You're a bad influence on me, Lillian Eldridge." "The best kind of influence," she corrected with a smile, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Without overthinking it, Vance leaned down and kissed her gently, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Lillian responded immediately, her arms slipping around his neck as she returned the kiss with a warmth that left him breathless. When they finally parted, Vance rested his forehead against hers, his heart pounding. "I think I've wanted to do that since the moment you stepped into the light of my campfire," he confessed. Lillian's smile was radiant. "I've been waiting for you to realize that." In the months that followed, Vance found himself transformed by love in ways he couldn't have imagined. The bitterness and isolation that had defined him for 3 years gradually gave way to a cautious optimism and a deepening connection not just with Lillian, but with the community around him. He still maintained some of his solitary habits, occasional solo rides into the countryside with Ghost, quiet evenings with just his thoughts for company, but he no longer felt the compulsion to keep moving, to outrun his past. Edward's freight business thrived under Vance's management of the new routes. His fair dealings with both customers and employees earned him respect throughout Helena, and he found a satisfaction in the work that he hadn't expected. Lillian flourished as a teacher, her natural warmth and intelligence making her popular with both students and parents. She moved out of her sister's home and into a small cottage near the school, establishing her independence while remaining close to family. Their courtship progressed steadily, with Vance spending many evenings at Lillian's cottage, sharing meals and conversations that deepened their understanding of each other. Though they were careful to maintain propriety, Helena was still a small town with watchful eyes. Their growing devotion was evident to anyone who saw them together. 6 months after arriving in Helena, Vance found himself standing outside Sheriff Patterson's office, contemplating a decision he'd been mulling over for weeks. "Doors open, Morgan," Patterson called from inside, his keen ears having detected Vance's presence on the boardwalk. Vance entered, removing his hat as he did so. "Sheriff, got a minute?" "For you, always," Patterson replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "What's on your mind?" "That deputy position still open?" Vance asked directly. Patterson studied him, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Been keeping it warm for you. Figured you'd come around eventually." Vance nodded, a sense of rightness settling over him. "I've been running from who I am for too long. It's time I faced it." "Good man," Patterson said, standing to shake Vance's hand. "You start Monday." That evening, Vance invited Lillian for a ride outside town. They followed a trail along the creek until they reached a promontory overlooking Helena. The town spread out before them in the golden light of sunset. "It's beautiful up here," Lillian said as they dismounted, leaving the horses to graze nearby. "I found it a few weeks ago," Vance explained, taking her hand and leading her to a large flat rock perfect for sitting. "I've been coming here to think." "About what?" she asked, settling beside him. Vance took a deep breath. "About the future. About who I want to be." He turned to face her directly. "I spoke with Patterson today, accepted the deputy position." Surprise and pleasure lit up her face. "Vance, that's wonderful. Are you sure it's what you want?" "I am," he said with certainty. "For the first time in years, I know exactly what I want." He took both her hands in his. "I want to be a man worthy of you, Lillian. A man who faces his past instead of running from it. A man who builds something lasting instead of drifting through life." Tears glistened in her eyes. "You've always been worthy," she whispered. "From the moment you shared your fire with me." Vance smiled at the memory, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I have something for you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a single diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight. "I love you, Lillian Eldridge. Will you marry me?" Joy transformed her face as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, I will marry you, Vance Morgan." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise of their shared future. As they rode back to town in the gathering dusk, Vance reflected on the journey that had led him to this moment. 3 years of solitude and self-imposed exile, broken by one fateful night when a determined woman had refused to be turned away from his campfire. He had thought himself beyond redemption, beyond happiness, yet here he was, returning to the work he was meant to do with the woman he was meant to love by his side. Their wedding took place the following spring, a simple ceremony in Helena's small church, attended by what seemed like half the town. Lillian was radiant in a gown of ivory silk, while Vance, still somewhat uncomfortable in formal attire, nevertheless cut a handsome figure in his new suit. Catherine served as matron of honor, with Edward as best man. Young Jamie and Emma had special roles too, Jamie as ring-bearer and Emma scattering flower petals down the aisle. Sheriff Patterson sat in the front pew, beaming with approval, alongside other friends they had made during their time in Helena. Even Ghost had a part to play, decorated with ribbons and waiting outside to carry them from the church to the reception at the town hall. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared to the beaming couple. "Mr. Morgan, you may kiss your bride." Vance didn't hesitate, drawing Lillian into his arms and kissing her to the cheers and applause of their friends and neighbors. As they walked back down the aisle together, Vance marveled at how completely his life had changed in less than a year. The reception was joyous, with dancing, speeches, and more food than the entire town could eat. Late in the evening, as Lillian danced with her brother-in-law, Sheriff Patterson approached Vance with a glass of whiskey in hand. "Never seen a man more transformed," he observed, handing the glass to Vance. "You look happy, son." "I am," Vance acknowledged, accepting the drink. "Happier than I ever thought possible." Patterson nodded sagely. "Love will do that. So will finding your purpose again." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Vance clinked his glass against the sheriff's. "To new beginnings." Later that night, as they prepared to leave for a short honeymoon at a lakeside cabin Edward had offered them, Lillian paused on the boardwalk, looking up at her husband. "What are you thinking?" she asked, seeing the thoughtful expression on his face. Vance smiled, drawing her close. "I was thinking about fires." "Fires?" she repeated, puzzled. "About how I never shared my fire until you sat down beside it," he explained, his voice soft with emotion. "How that one decision changed everything." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Best decision you ever made," she teased gently. "Second best," he corrected, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Asking you to marry me was the best." Lillian rose on tiptoes to kiss him, her love evident in the gentle pressure of her lips against his. "Take me home, Deputy Morgan," she whispered when they parted. "Yes, madam," he replied with a smile, leading her toward their waiting horse and the new life they would build together. Epilogue. 5 years later. The sunset painted the Montana sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple as Vance Morgan sat on the porch of his home at the edge of Helena, watching his 4-year-old son chase fireflies in the front yard. Little Thomas, named for the kind homesteader who had offered them shelter on their journey, had his mother's dark hair and Vance's determined spirit. "Not too far, Thomas," Vance called as the boy ventured toward the edge of the property. "Stay where I can see you." "Yes, Papa," came the obedient reply, though the child continued his enthusiastic pursuit of the glowing insects. The screen door opened behind him, and Lillian emerged with their 1-year-old daughter Catherine cradled in her arms. The little girl was already asleep, her chubby cheeks flushed and her tiny hands curled into fists. "She finally surrendered," Lillian said with a tired smile, settling into the rocking chair beside Vance's. "Most stubborn child I've ever encountered." "Takes after her mother," Vance teased, reaching over to stroke his daughter's soft hair. Lillian laughed softly. "I prefer to think of it as determination, and she clearly inherited it from both of us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Thomas's adventures in the gathering dusk. The past 5 years had been full for both of them. Vance had been promoted to sheriff when Patterson retired 2 years earlier, while Lillian continued teaching at the school, taking time off only for the births of their children. Their home, a sturdy 2-story house Vance had built largely with his own hands and the help of friends, stood as a testament to their commitment to putting down roots. Ghost, now older but still strong, grazed contentedly in the paddock beside the small barn. They had added 2 more horses to their family as well, a gentle mare for Lillian and a spirited pony that Thomas would soon be old enough to ride. "Letter came from Catherine and Edward today," Lillian said after a while. "Jamie's doing well at that school back east, and Emma's apparently set her sights on becoming a doctor." Vance smiled. "Good for her. She's got the brains for it." "Edward's business is expanding again," Lillian continued. "He mentioned he might need your advice on some new routes when you have time." "Happy to help," Vance replied, "though things have been busy at the office lately with all the new settlers coming in." Helena had grown substantially in the years they had lived there, becoming a proper city with all the challenges that entailed. Vance's job as sheriff kept him busy, but he made it a point to be home for dinner with his family every night unless an emergency demanded otherwise. The nightmares that had once plagued him, remnants of his time in Kansas City, had largely subsided, replaced by dreams of the future he was building. "Thomas," Lillian called suddenly, "time to come in, sweetheart. It's getting dark." The boy trudged back toward the house, his earlier exuberance giving way to the drowsiness of a long day's play. "Can I have a story, Mama?" he asked as he climbed the porch steps. "One story," Lillian promised, "after you wash up." Thomas scampered inside, and Lillian rose to follow, pausing to kiss Vance on the cheek. "Don't stay out too late, it's getting chilly." "Just a few more minutes," he assured her. "I'll be right in." As darkness settled over the land, Vance remained on the porch, contemplating the life he now led. From solitary traveler to husband, father, and respected lawman, it was a transformation he could never have anticipated that night by the fire when a determined young woman had refused to be turned away. He thought often of that night, of how close he had come to missing this happiness. Had he maintained his isolation, had he sent Lillian on her way instead of sharing his fire, none of this would exist, not his family, not his home, not the peace he had finally found. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, familiar constellations he had once used to navigate his endless wandering. Now they simply marked the passage of seasons over a life rooted in love and purpose. With a contented sigh, Vance rose from his chair and went inside to join his family. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, casting a warm glow over the main room where Lillian sat in a rocking chair. Thomas at her feet and baby Catherine in her arms. The scene before him, his wife, his children, his home, filled Vance with a profound gratitude. "There you are," Lillian said, smiling up at him. "Thomas is waiting for his story." "And what story would you like tonight, son?" Vance asked, settling into his chair beside the fire. Thomas's eyes lit up. "Tell me about the time you and Mama met, about your campfire." Vance exchanged a warm glance with Lillian, then leaned forward, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that his children loved. "Well, it was a cold evening in the Montana wilderness. I had made my camp for the night and built my fire, just as I always did." As he recounted their beginning, embellishing certain parts for his young audience's benefit, Vance watched the firelight play across Lillian's face, still as beautiful to him as it had been that first night. She met his gaze over their children's heads, her eyes filled with love and the shared knowledge of how far they had come together. "And that, Thomas," Vance concluded, "is how your mama taught me the most important lesson I ever learned." "What lesson, Papa?" the boy asked, stifling a yawn. Vance reached out, taking Lillian's hand in his. "That sometimes the greatest journey a man can make isn't across mountains or plains, but from solitude to love. And it all begins with being willing to share your fire."